So I ask you to welcome Stewart McPherson to tell us the story of his making of Britain's Treasure Islands.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. It's such a great pleasure to show this update of what I've been up to. So, in a nutshell, thank you also for that very kind introduction. The treasure of the territories is not gold or silver. It's something way more special and more valuable. It's the incredible wildlife, completely unique cultures, and incredible history that occur on all of the territories in totally different ways. I can only show you the absolute tip of the iceberg tonight. I wish I could give you a lecture on every single one of the territories, but, well, unless you wish to stay till the morning, I guess that's not really going to happen. So today, my goal is to show you just the absolute tip of a dazzling rainbow of stories from all of these territories. They're all completely unique, all completely special, but very, very, very underappreciated in the UK. I mean, who would have thought everything from rainforests to beautiful coral reefs to deserts to icy wastes and Antarctic wastes and everything in between. I also have to say a very special thank you to the UK Overseas Territories Conservation Forum. Absolutely loads, lots and lots and lots of partners, lots and lots of the non-governmental organisations, and also hundreds of people across all of the territories that made this possible. So a very, very sincere thank you to everyone that has been so kind to help with this. Just to tell you very briefly of who I am and why I've done this. So my name is Stewart McPherson. I grew up absolutely obsessed with nature. I had 50 species of stick insects in my bedroom as a kid, salamanders, chameleons, you name it. I had a little zoo in my bedroom. And I always dreamt of becoming a wildlife filmmaker. But the problem is that there's no easy way to do that. You don't pass an exam and, like a lawyer or a doctor and get on a clear path. It's much, much more fluid than that. So while I was at university, I undertook a load of expeditions as a student and discovered a couple of species while as a student and wrote 2 books at uni. I graduated exactly 10 years ago, took out a loan, set up a company and wrote, I started a project to write 25 books looking at carnivorous plants and basically set out to visit and explore and climb about 300 mountains all over the world to search for different groups of carnivorous plants. And along the way, I was very lucky to discover about 30 taxa of different plants, carnivorous plants, including a giant pitcher plant, which I named after David Attenborough. Anyway, the problem with all this, it worked in the sense that it got me a step closer to my goal, but I only got to do a few short bits in documentaries. And my dream was to present and create series and showcase the natural world in all its beauty and splendor. I wrote loads of proposals and treatments, but every single time I'd send them to production companies, they'd be really excited. I'd send them more information, then it'd go quiet, and I'd see exactly that idea being made 6 months later without me, often even including species that I myself named and discovered. So I thought, well, I've just got to give this a go and roll the dice and give it a shot. So 4 years ago, I set out to start this project, and through the help of so many people, it's now complete. The project sets out to make a broadcast TV series, which, as Mike very kindly mentioned a minute ago, has been broadcast already in numerous countries. And just today, the BBC has confirmed it's scheduled for April the 14th. Possibly it might change a day or two, but basically April the 14th in a few weeks' time. Also, as Mike also mentioned, 40 short mini-documentaries using the footage not used in the broadcast series. A book also to raise money for the territories, and we've already raised over 20 grand for them, and a website which has just gone live today, and I'll tell you about it at the end. So to show you the territories, what are they? Like I say, my goal tonight is just to show you a very, very brief overview of all of them, to give you a flavour of all of them, to showcase this incredible heritage that very few people in the UK know that's part of the UK's heritage. Politically, there's 14 territories, although there's kind of 16 in the sense that one, which consists of Ascension, St. Helena, and Tristan to Cunha, is politically one territory, although they're 3 very isolated and geographically remote groups of islands. So in a sense, there's sort of 16 if you treat those separately. So there's 3 in the South Atlantic, Ascension, St. Helena, and Tristan to Cunha. 3 in the very far south of the Central Atlantic and the Southern Ocean, the Falklands, South Georgia, and the South Sandwich Islands. and the British Antarctic Territory, one in the middle of the Indian Ocean, the British Indian Ocean Territory, one in the Pacific, and then 6 in the Caribbean and the North Atlantic, and then also 2 in the Mediterranean. And so this is going to be our whirlwind tour for tonight, to go and look at all of them very briefly. If you put them all together, they actually represent an area 7 times the size of the UK. Most of that land is in the British Antarctic Territory, but even without that, they have 20 times the biodiversity of the UK, and they're disproportionately important in the sense that they have well over 1,000 unique species. They're important because they're often many of them consist of tiny islands, but those tiny islands are breeding sites for animals that often migrate over hundreds or thousands of kilometers or even entire hemispheres to reach them. So even though many of them are pinpricks of land, they're unbelievably important for wildlife. And because they're extremely isolated, including some of the most geographically isolated islands in the world, that they're also centers that have driven evolution in often wonderful and strange and unexpected ways. As a consequence, we get some extraordinary animals across them. So for those reasons. As Mike also mentioned, 4 years ago, I set out to do this project. I was a little bit unrealistic. I thought I could do it in a year. In the end, it took 229 days. I had to go on Royal Air Force flights, one of the last working Royal Mail ships, cargo vessels, charter yachts. But as I say, it was a difficult journey in some ways, but well over 300 conservationists and over 30 NGOs helped. Just to be crystal clear, and this is often misunderstood, the territories are not colonies. They're very easy to misportray them or sensationalize them, and several books have done that. They're one of 3 things. Most of them are places that democratically choose to remain under UK sovereignty. Some are military bases, and some are totally uninhabited. So they're not colonies. It's a modern relationship. Let's say. So my journey started at Brize Norton 4 years ago, RAF Brize Norton in Oxfordshire, and I boarded a RAF flight, basically to head south down to Ascension Island. Ascension Island is perhaps the most un-British of all the territories in terms of its landscape. It's a land of volcanic wastes and desert. It's a young island. It's only about 1 million years old, which in geological terms is extremely young. And it's a land of volcanic ash fields and plains and cinder cones, and every cinder cone is slightly different coloration. Despite being hostile and lashed by the Southern Ocean, it was actually incredibly important strategically for the Royal Navy up to 200 years ago. In fact, earlier than that, for Portuguese and other nationalities. But no one claimed it until about 200 years ago. The British settled there. Initially, it had been used for stopping off points, and for various ships would drop off sailors, often criminal sailors that would be abandoned on the island. But after Napoleon Bonaparte was exiled to St. Helena, the British garrisoned the island, and it became strategically very, very important. Massive stockpiles were put in place there to supply ships going around the capes. And in a very real sense, many of these territories have changed the face of the map. Without the territories, without what are now the territories, many of the voyages of exploration and discovery would certainly have taken different paths, and our impact on the world would have certainly been very different. Ascension Island is one of the most important of all, particularly in terms of scurvy and supplying ships. And those early ships that called in noticed the fact that it's one of the largest nesting sites of green turtles. Thousands of green turtles come to the island today. No one knows how many did originally, probably far higher still. The turtles come in immense numbers. This is a single night on just one of the beaches on the island. The early mariners from the beginning of the 19th century onwards, of course, noticed the turtles as a source of meat. If you're on a ship that's going around the world, particularly on the return journey, having had months or even years of living on rancid old meat or sea biscuits, which by all accounts were less than palatable, and saw a massive turtle, which was a fresh hunk of fresh meat, of course you'd want to eat it, and that happened in immense numbers. Initially, the turtles were just killed on the beaches and slaughtered and butchered there. But they were so valued that massive ponds were built on the island where turtles were brought in because the turtles would only come during the breeding season. So stocks of turtles could be kept here throughout the year, supplying large numbers of ships. So it became very, very important. Unfortunately, the population of turtles was absolutely decimated. It absolutely collapsed. But as we will see on many of the other territories, very early conservation thinking came into play. And about 100 years ago, the turtles were very strictly conserved, and they've exploded back in numbers. And now it's the second largest nesting turtle population anywhere in the Atlantic. And the turtles are coming back in vast numbers every year. The ships that went to Ascension Island had other impacts too. Inadvertently, they introduced rodents, rats in particular, but also cats and dogs and other mammals. And these absolutely decimated the seabird colonies. Ascension, like many islands, many remote islands across the world, supported enormous colonies and populations of seabirds, basically for the general lack of land-based predators. And the introduction of rats and cats absolutely devastated this. If you go there today, you'll see markings like this on many of the rocks, and they can cover entire landscapes. And these are the ghost colonies. These are the extinct nest sites of birds that died out 100 years or more ago, and they're still there. They've been baked like concrete in the sun. You could just picture, close your eyes and picture the sounds, the noise, the chaos of this landscape of millions of birds. But today there was not one in this area, not one. The birds retreated. Fortunately, and we'll see this again and again on the territories, there was one little island off the coast of Ascension. It's called Bosun Bird Island. And the birds found refuge on there. The rats and the cats never got there. So they retreated there in large numbers, and I was fortunate to go there. And climbing up, you reach a bird paradise, seeing the bosun bird from which the island gets its name, to reach the summit, which is just caked with birds. Literally, the island, geologically it's volcanic, it should be black, but it's caked in guano, and the summit is absolutely covered in birds. But there's one species that's really special. This is the Ascension Island frigate bird. And when the species was wiped out on the mainland, that little island was the only place on Earth where this bird survived, the only place on the planet. It's an area just a few times bigger than this room. Well, about a few years ago, the conservationists on the island and the RSPB undertook a very important conservation project. The rats were eradicated on the mainland, and slowly the seabirds started to come back to Ascension Island, one by one by one. All of them except the most important. All of them except the Ascension Island frigate bird. So the conservationists built plastic dummies, model frigate birds, and put them just on the island. And while I was there, while I was filming on the island, something magical happened. The first time in 185 years, since the time of Charles Darwin when he visited here, the very first frigate birds returned back. 2 pairs. One failed to raise a nest and the other succeeded. And this little guy here is the very first frigate bird back on the Ascension mainland for over 185 years. And in the years since, it's exploded. There's now about 200, 300 back on the island. It's just a wonderful success story. Anyway, the island, said earlier, it's very dry, very, very, very arid, very, very hostile. And this was obviously very apparent to the people who settled and garrisoned it. Water was a very significant problem here. There's just 2 very unreliable and small drips in the center of the island. So, remember, this is what the island looks like. So, Charles Darwin visited here on the return voyage of the Beagle, as did his great friend, later, who became his great friend, Joseph Hooker, the great botanist who later became director of Kew Gardens. His father at the time was director of Kew Gardens. Joseph Hooker was asked by the Admiralty to improve the island. So he developed an extraordinary idea, an extraordinary experiment. And he was much encouraged by Darwin as well. The idea was very simple. It was to turn this into a rainforest. The idea was simple. It was to send down hundreds, thousands of plants on all ships going to Ascension. They would carry pots of palms, begonias, trees, you name it, all the ships carried plants. They planted them at the very top of the tallest peak in the hope that the plants, as they grew up, would drop leaf litter, keep moisture in the ground, perhaps even start evapotranspiring and creating rain, or at least certainly collecting the rain and the humidity off those coastal winds that come off the Southern Ocean. And the experiment not just worked, it worked unbelievably well. It's an astonishing success. As you climb up the mountain today, there's 3 very distinct layers. The bottom layer is the equivalent of dry, spiny scrub forest that occurs in semi-arid areas across the world. It's full of eucalypts from Australia and cacti from the Americas. It's hot and relatively dry. A little bit higher up is lush tropical rainforest with bananas from Asia, palms, maidenhair ferns, platycerium fern epiphytes, big trees, and so forth. And at the very top of the mountain, there's a belt of cloud forest covered with huge ficus trees, immense tall branches, just like in the tropical mountains across the world, like in Southeast Asia, where I was exploring for those carnivorous plants. Is exactly very, very, very comparable. They're all covered in moss in the top layer, very, very, very mossy, very humid. And the experiment worked. It produced an immense amount of water. They built a huge catchment on the other side, and that supplied the garrison. And that tallest peak today is now known as Green Mountain for obvious reasons. This experiment benefited a lot of wildlife on the island in the sense that the plants, because it was a relatively clean slate, relatively few animals were impacted. When you introduce non-native species, there is always an impact, and usually it's disastrous. But in this case, because Ascension was a relatively clean slate, it was not as the impact was not as negative as other places. And a few of the animals actually, in some ways, found additional food in the sense of land crabs. And today they migrate in huge numbers down to the coast a few times a year. And I was very lucky to be there and see one of the massive migrations going down into the water as the females release their eggs. I'd love to tell you more about Ascension, but we've got lots of other territories to get through. My last day on Ascension was marked with the arrival of one of the last working Royal Mail postal ships, Royal Mail ships, the RMS St. Helena. She called in and obviously was taking me to the namesake island, St. Helena. After a 2-day voyage, we got to St. Helena, and it's this exquisite jewel in the South Atlantic. This is Jamestown, the capital, in this narrow valley. And it's constrained between these very, very, very narrow gorge. It too was very, very, very important for ships navigating, particularly around the Capes, again as a resupply and victualling station, and it has an extremely important history for hundreds of years in that sense. Queen Victoria made it a city in 1859, so it's a British city in the middle of the South Atlantic. And of course you'll recognize a lot of the architecture, spectacular, beautiful English architecture. And it even has its own currency. There's approximately 3,000 people on the island, and it has a charming, wonderful currency, which is tied to the British pound, but nevertheless is its own St. Helena pound. It's an island of enormous contrasts. Around the coasts, it's actually very dry and relatively arid, but just a few kilometers inland, just a few kilometers, it's green and lush and verdant. Charles Darwin called it a world unto itself, and it really is. It's one of the most extraordinary places. It's much, much older than Ascension Island, and that's obviously given a far longer time period for plants and animals to reach the island and speciate on it. And as a consequence, it has far, far, far greater concentrations of unique life. It has dozens of unique plants. It had many unique birds. It has just one surviving, called the wirebird today. But what really makes it special is its invertebrates. It has well over 460 unique species of invertebrates. It's often called the Galapagos of the South Atlantic. And still today, new species are being discovered. It's absolutely extraordinary how many are here. It's many, 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 many times more than the entire British Isles, even though it's a tiny, tiny, tiny pinprick of land. It has some real oddities like the spiky yellow woodlouse, which unlike woodlice here in England that live under logs, these ones live on the leaves of ferns, underneath the leaves of ferns. And likewise, a beautiful spider called the golden sail spider with a metallic abdomen. And this incredible animal that I dreamt of as a kid, the giant earwig, the largest earwig that ever lived, that is up to 7 centimeters. I don't know if there's any earwig enthusiasts in the room, but it's really unique. It's the biggest earwig that ever existed, but sadly it's died out, or it's believed to have died out just within living memory. The last ones were seen in the 70s or possibly 80s, and it does appear to be that it's no more. Part of the big impact here was likewise, as on Ascension, introduced rats, rodents, cats, dogs, massive clearance of the vegetation by settlers and so forth. But particularly this. New Zealand flax was introduced, and many flax mills, such as this one, were constructed to make twine, basically make rope. This is what supplies basically every purpose for twine. The Royal Mail, but also ship ropes, all sorts of different purposes. And it was produced in really large numbers on the island and exported particularly to the UK, but also to other parts of the world. But of course, the introduction of synthetic materials destroyed the industry, completely made it collapse. And the flax plants have grown absolutely rampant and cover the entire swathes of the island. So even though you look at a green landscape such as this one, and it looks verdant and green and full of life, not all as well. There's nothing basically native there. That's entirely flax, and it pushes out virtually every other species there. Unfortunately, this dealt the conservationists a really critical, urgent crisis. They had dozens and dozens and dozens of species that were down to the last few of their kind, and in some cases, for plants, literally the last of their kind. There were many species of plants that was just one left of known in the world. And for some, like the St. Helena olive, it was unfortunately too late. You're looking at a photo of a species that exists no more. It's a ghost. Others, though, many others, were saved just in the nick of time. And through wonderful work, particularly with the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew, large numbers have been propagated and rebuilt in a really, really impressive scale. And for example, the Millennium Forest on St. Helena, which aims to rebuild an entire ecosystem. And over 10,000 native trees have been planted. And there's a really inspiring point here. The conservationists know that they will never see the fruits of their labor, in the sense that it'll probably take 200 years for the trees to fully mature and the forest to regrow. But they're doing it anyway. It's really, really inspiring. And virtually every islander on the island has funded plantations of at least one tree. So it's a really wonderful project that's reclaiming some of this unique world. Of course, St. Helena, I can't leave it before mentioning Napoleon Bonaparte. I'm sure all of you know he spent the last 6 years at the battle at the end of Waterloo. Someone came up to him and said, "You'll be shackled to a rock where the memory of your own greatness will gnaw at you." And that came true. He was sent to St. Helena to spend out the last 6 years of his life. The British sent a really, really petty governor called Hudson Lowe, who basically tormented him constantly, and Napoleon tried to play games with him. He cut little holes in the wooden shutters and spied on them, but eventually, sadly, died here in this room, and that's his a copy of his death mask right there. Anyway, the next territory is Tristan da Cunha, a bit further south still. And this territory is really special. It's the most remote inhabited island in the world. It's quite hard to try and convey what that really means. It's 2,800 kilometers from Cape Town, the only way you can really get there on any regular basis. If Tristan were here, where London is now, the nearest settlement, Cape Town, would be past Moscow away. So just imagine that. Imagine trying to run a settlement with your nearest supply chain being past Moscow away. It's really quite incredible. It's home to 270 people, and one of the territories that I desperately, most of all, wanted to visit and explore. There are a number of ships. There's about 8 or 9 vessels. A vessel goes there about 8 or 9 times a year, on which you can buy passage, but totally understandably, the Tristanians, of course, get priority and for medical emergencies and so forth. So I kept getting bumped off. And when I got to Cape Town, the supply vessel was in dry docks. The fishing vessel was in dry docks. So I contacted 20 yacht companies to try and charter my own yacht with a crew, but not one of them responded, except the very last one. A vessel called the Supreme Lady was willing to go there. So needless to say, I chartered her and we set off, leaving Cape Town. I thought it was going to take maybe 12 days, something like that. In Cape Town, there was the yacht club we left from. It was called the False Bay Yacht Club. And there were lots of salty old sea dogs in there, sort of saying, "Oh, it'll take 3 months," and things like this, obviously not in an accent. And of course, none of them had, in a South African accent, I mean, none of them, of course, had ever been there. None of them had ever done this. But they were all determined to tell me that probably I wouldn't make it, or probably I'd sink and die halfway through. But anyway, none of them had done it. So we thought we'd just go ahead and give it a shot. We thought it would take 12 days. And remember, this is near the roaring 40s, the famous latitudes for mountainous roaring oceans and seas and waves the size of houses. And so I'd prepared myself for really, really rough conditions. But when we got out there, something very strange happened. The winds, well, first of all, I forgot my razor and only had a couple of books. But second of all, the winds totally died. There was nothing. There was not a breath of air. We actually were going backwards pretty much at some points. I can't explain why. It's not the doldrums. This isn't that latitude. This should be rough and roaring. And infuriatingly, on the radio, coming from South Africa, every day the radio reporter would be talking about our sector of the South Atlantic, saying, "Oh yeah, no, it's terribly rough and gale force winds," and we were there in the reality, and it was completely calm. Anyway, a week of this passed. A week. Unfortunately, the people that I were with were lovely. We were on this tiny little yacht, and we all got on very, very, very well. But a week of this passed, and I was starting to get a little bit worried. We'd only brought a few cans of diesel because it's a sailing vessel. We were expecting to sail. And then suddenly this emerged on the horizon, after seeing nothing for a week. A massive, massive tanker. We hailed her by radio, saying, "Tanker on the horizon. This is small sailing vessel with a white sail. Over." And the captain came on and said, "Yes, what do you want?" And we basically said, "Look, this is the situation. We're stuck here. We haven't got any fuel. Do you have any diesel? We'll happily wire you funds. We'll pay whatever you need. Just can you drop a tank over?" And the skipper on the Supreme Lady had said this happened all the time. They don't care about a drum or two. They'll just chuck it over, and we can just go and pick it up and then keep on our merry way. The captain went away and had a think, and then came back a few minutes later and said, "Look, we really want to help you. The problem is we've got 70 million gallons of petrol, but not a drop of diesel." So very sadly, it wasn't to be, and we just had to sit there, just watch the tanker just disappear and sail off. Anyway, after 21 days, finally, we were getting close to Tristan. We were within 2 kilometers from the island, but it was dead white mist, dead, totally invisible sea mist. You could see a few hundred meters in front of the bow. But then, suddenly through the mist, just in the mist, this shadow emerged from the clouds, and finally, the most remote inhabited island appeared out of the mist. And this dream of going to Tristan finally came true. And I must admit, after 21 days, I really was quite glad to see the island. Anyway, we anchored offshore, and the next day came on shore. And the settlement is called Edinburgh of the Seven Seas. A perfect name for the settlement. It has about 270 people. And it's, too, a bit like Ascension, St. Helena has a fascinating history, also in some ways connected to Napoleon. It was garrisoned when Napoleon was sent to St. Helena, and it was quickly realized that the French were never going to use it as a staging post to try and rescue Bonaparte. It was just never going to happen. So the garrison was withdrawn, but Corporal William Glass and a few of his men elected voluntarily, totally under their own choice, to stay on the island and found a settlement. And it grew as a settlement to supply ships, particularly as the whaling trade and the sealing trade of the Southern Ocean exploded in the 18th and 19th centuries, ships would call in and basically barter and trade for supplies. And many early accounts document visiting it, although many captains often missed the island, and many say to find it once was a miracle, to find it twice was impossible, because it really is, the seas can be rough there, as I well knew. The Tristanians have fascinating history and culture. Traditionally, they built houses out of the volcanic stone on the island. And still today, many of the houses were still of that original construct that were sometimes a century or more old, but of course now have metal roofs. And of course, a sign. There is a supermarket, the only shop on the island, but when I went there, it was closed. So you'll notice I progressively get a beard in these next photos. The Tristanians are incredibly hardworking and illustrious. They run a very successful fishery for lobsters. It's a very remote, isolated island, and no one really properly knows why, but very large concentrations of lobsters, rock lobsters, occur there. And the Tristanians export them all the way around the world now. They export them to England, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. Selfridges sells them, so you can buy them if you wish, and many other places and other markets. There's only one road leading out of the settlement. It's about roughly 2 kilometres long, and charmingly, there's a bus. And it really makes sense. It might seem strange that there's something like 70, 80 vehicles and a bus on an island just with a few kilometres of road, but it actually doesn't feel out of place at all. They need to get around, and their main agriculture areas, the patches down the road, about 2 kilometres away. So their principal crop is potatoes, and they're cultivated in these little patches that they set up and often pass down from generation to generation. The island itself is a large volcano, and I desperately wanted to find out what was on the top of the volcano. So climbed up with some friends from the settlement one day, and on the slopes of the volcano, there's this extraordinary lost world of a very, very interesting tree fern. It grows about 3 feet or so tall, and it covers the landscape, absolutely covers it. And in this bizarre forest, there are many unique species, including this beautiful yellow-nosed albatross, which occurs only on the Tristan group of islands, and several other unique birds, such as this moorhen. In the Tristan group of islands consists of 4 islands. The southernmost is called Gough Island, and I really wanted to go there, but for quite a macabre reason I'll tell you about in a few minutes. It is, though, very rough. It is not a joke. Many people have lost their lives trying to land on Gough Island. Just a few years ago, one of the trawlers I showed you earlier, tried to land. They were doing work just looking at their nets at the back of the vessel, and their little launch got lost and overturned, and one of the men in it drowned. The survivor got to the island. They sent out another vessel to try and get the survivor, but that overturned as well, and one of those men on that second vessel also lost their lives. And the survivors had to spend 10 days on the island before they could be helicoptered off. So it really is not a joke. It can be insanely rough. I was really worried about this going down there in this little yacht, but happily, when I got there, it was the most perfect, still, ridiculously calm weather. It's uninhabited except for a weather station, and the people on the weather station told me it was the first day for 40 days that had been calm, and calm enough to land on the island. So we were ridiculously lucky. Anyway, got ashore, and it's home to over 90% of the world's northern rockhopper penguins and large numbers of subantarctic fur seals, and most of the population of a unique albatross called the Tristan albatross. But it was also home to some other animals that were introduced sometime in the 19th century. No one really knows exactly when. House mice were introduced. Just the humble little mouse, just a little Mickey Mouse was introduced. There were no predators, no land predators at all on the island. They had a complete run of the island and a massive supply of protein in the form of the albatross chicks. The mice, you have to be very careful using the word evolve. Most people use it incorrectly, but in this case, it is correct. They have evolved within last 2 centuries and become the monster mice of Gough Island. They're up to 27 centimetres now, 27 centimetres, including their tail. Superficially, they can look like rats, but they're actually derived from mice. And they attack the albatross chicks, particularly at night, and just basically nip at their sides. And the albatross chicks, because they've evolved with no adaptations whatsoever to do with predators, they have no response, no ability to defend themselves or any defense mechanism, and basically are literally eaten alive. It's horrific. And there's serious ideas and proposals to try and eradicate them, because if the situation was to continue, many unique species could be lost. The island, Gough Island, is often seen as one of the most important bird sites in the world. It has tens of millions of seabirds on it. It's again, what I was saying at the start, even though it's a pinprick of land, it's massively important for many, many, many reasons. A bit further south still, the Falkland Islands. The Falklands, I can't explain why, was a place I dreamt about visiting ever since I was a child. I don't know why. I was just pulled to go there and dreamt of going there for many, many, many years. It has a fascinating history wrapped up in the early exploration of the Southern Ocean. And it's quite striking. Sometimes some parts of Stanley can very, very closely resemble parts of London. And you could almost substitute this for many streets not far from this building. It, of course, has a wonderful culture of its own right, but it does have some interesting connections, pubs and fish and chips and so forth, but also some fascinating settlements around the archipelago, very interesting settlements on the more remote islands and on the large areas which Charles Darwin recorded, the gauchos roaming and cattle herding and wild horses, which today are primarily used with sheep farming. Of course, tragically, it was, of course, the site of the Falklands War, and that's what most people remember it, of course, for. And there are, of course, the signs of that tragic conflict across the islands, and many of the ruins of the downed helicopters have been deliberately left so people will remember. I was invited to take part and follow the deminers for a day, and there's over 30,000 landmines still in the ground, and basically they're still totally active, even 30 years on, because they're plastic and because there's virtually no metal in them. They're extremely hard to detect. And within kilometres from Stanley, there's very large minefields. And the mining teams are in many ways unsung heroes, because they're doing a wonderful job clearing the mines. It's basically the only way you can do it is manually. They follow the Argentine maps and little by little eradicate the mines which they know are located. It's an unbelievably difficult job. And the mining teams told me that if I went from point A to point B, there were so many mines, I would be guaranteed to not make it to the other side of the field. That obviously this is a trench they had cleared, and they invited me to walk along it, but basically said if you step outside the zone, there's no way you'll be able to make it out of the field. I was there completely by coincidence for the referendum that took place, in which they overwhelmingly voted to remain a UK overseas territory. It is a fascinating place because it's not what most people imagine. If you say Falklands to most people, they think rain and sheep. But actually, it's a semi-arid area. It's drier than many parts of the UK. And that's the reason why there's no trees. It's not because of temperature. It's generally because of aridity. And it has extraordinary beaches, which, again, I was completely not expecting going there. And a stunning, dramatic, beautifully landscape that in many ways reminded me of parts of Scotland. It's an unconventional beauty, a beauty that really sings to your soul and really, really captured me. But also some amazing wildlife spectacles. Some of the largest penguins, certainly for gentoo penguins, some of the largest in the world, and the biggest albatross colonies on the planet, along with this incredible bird called the striated caracara. This bird mugged Charles Darwin. Darwin, in his Voyage of the Beagle, records these birds stealing things from the Beagle and stealing possessions from his shipmates. And so I went amongst them to sit down amongst them to see what would happen. And I put down a leather bag. One of them hopped over and opened the bag and stole my notes and hopped off with it. And so I went to chase after him to try and get my notes back. And as I was following that bird, another one came over and took out my wallet and nicked 10 quid in coins. And really, they're the most extraordinary birds. We filmed all this, and it's in the series. So you can see it if you don't believe me. They're scavengers. They're attracted to anything that they're not used to. They take it back to the nest and explore it. So they're naturally very, very curious and inquisitive and very interesting. And you can see them here trying to steal my stuff. And with some of my coins, little rascals, I'll go back and get them someday. The Falklands was home to a unique animal called the wara, or the Falklands wolf. When Darwin visited in the 1830s, he reported the animal was massively in decline and so tame that all you had to do was hold out a bit of meat, and the wolf would come up to you, but with a knife in that hand, the gauchos would kill it and would just stab it from the side and kill the wara. And very quickly after Darwin left, it passed into extinction. So even though the Falklands have been impacted, they're still home, though, to some incredible spectacles. On the islands that still are relatively intact, often at night the tussock grass explodes with sooty shearwaters. This is on Kidney Island. And tens of thousands of birds just turn the sky almost black at the height of their return. There's just so many of them. Anyway, to go from the Falklands to the next territories I needed to visit was a little harder. I needed to go to South Georgia and the British Antarctic Territory. There are no airstrips at all on South Georgia. It's uninhabited. And there's none that we could use in the British Antarctic Territory. So the only way I could go there was by ship. So I had to persuade 16 friends of mine, a few of them are in the audience, to join me because I needed to cover the costs of the ships. We needed two, one to be on in order to film, another one to have it in the story. So I managed to persuade 16 friends to come along and split the costs, and we hired two ships, these two. And when I went on board, the very first thing I found was the captain hacking apart a reindeer that he'd shot on his island. He owns an island where he'd introduced where reindeer occur, and he'd just shot one and was hacking it apart, reminding me that there were no shops or supplies where we were going. So we went to South Georgia first, and finally, after about 6 days, reached the island. And as I was saying earlier, real concentration of wildlife, real hotspot. Even though it's described as a slice of the Alps thrust up out of the ocean, it has incredible significance for wildlife. Basically, the wildlife from the Southern Ocean drains here to breed. It's one of the very few islands down in the deep Southern Ocean that is free of ice around it. It's free of ice in winter, generally. That's usually the case. Unlike Antarctica, which has hundreds, if not thousands, over 1,000 kilometers of ice around the continent during winter, South Georgia generally doesn't have any, or any significant. And as a consequence, enormous numbers of birds, seabirds, come here. Something like 50 million birds are believed to live on or breed on the island or live on the island at different parts of the year, including some of the most spectacular populations of penguins. And remember, all of the wildlife you're seeing here, the UK government is responsible for. I mean, who would have thought? It's something like a third of the world's penguins live in British overseas territories. It's extraordinary. This one colony alone on Salisbury Plain is home to something like 500,000 penguins. They form an immense sea of birds, as well as elephant seals that battle on the beaches. They can weigh up to 4 tons. That's 40 times my weight. And huge numbers, something like 3 to 4 million fur seals that were nearly wiped out in the 19th century. They went down to something like 100 animals or 200 animals, but they've exploded back in the last century. This concentration of wildlife, of course, attracted the attention of many, particularly whalers. Many, many whaling stations were built on the island over the last century, about 7 major ones. And they supplied up to 90% of the whale oil at the height, which prior to the real rise of petrochemicals, this was used for everything from the street lamps in London to, you name it, the nitroglycerin in World War I bombs, and even the harpoons for whaling. It was extraordinary. Up to 3,000 people lived in those whaling stations, and massive tanks were built containing the oil that they extracted from the blubber of those great whales. And the legacy of that's still visible. And even some of the tanks, even still today, drip the remnants of whale oil in the cold, such as here. It's quite amazing in some ways. And by no means should we judge people of the past with standards of today. That's not fair or not possible. But there's a haunting fact. The largest whale, the largest animal ever to have existed is the blue whale, Balamptera musculus, this animal here. And it was reduced down to estimates, some people say between 0.1% of the natural population to 1%. It doesn't really matter. A fraction of the natural population. Certainly no more than 1%, but maybe even a tenth of a percent of the natural levels. And the stations closed not because of the moratorium. That came years later. They closed because it was no longer profitable to hunt the whales any longer. There were just simply too few of them left in the waters for it to be viable to hunt them. And the haunting statistic is this. If the stations had continued for 1 year longer than they did, if someone had just taken a gamble and bankrolled them for just 1 year more, there would have been too few blue whales left in the ocean just to have chance encounters to reproduce. And marine biologists have suggested that we came within 1 year of wiping out the biggest animal ever to have existed. So just imagine, had that happened, you go to the Natural History Museum just down the road and see that enormous model of a blue whale hanging there. And imagine explaining that to your kids that we wiped that out. It came so close. They are recovering, but still the whales down there, some species are recovering very well, others, like the blue whale, very slowly. The next territory is the British Antarctic Territory. So this place is very special just for the immensity and the epic scale of it. Bear in mind that 90% of an iceberg is underwater. This is one of our little ships on a relatively small iceberg, near a relatively small iceberg. The epic scale of this place unfolds before your eyes when you get there. It's a land of extraordinary icy beauty, unbelievable scenic beauty, and of course, a surprising amount of wildlife. These are very rich waters, even though they're so cold, particularly animals such as leopard seals, one of the top predators down there. And we filmed the leopard seals and watched them quite often. One of them was attacking a penguin, and they play with their victims. They'll find a penguin, rip its wing off, and keep dragging it out and watching it circle and pulling it underwater. They can be unbelievably cruel, and eventually rip it to pieces, as is happening here. Well, we were out in a Zodiac watching and filming it, and then it came up to the side of the Zodiac and started poking its head over and looking at us. And bearing in mind they can weigh over a ton and could easily upturn our vessel, we thought we'd better get out of there. So quickly returned back to the vessel. We went to a couple of the British stations, such as Port Lockroy, which is home to some very patriotic penguins that are trumpeting underneath the Union flag. But inside, it's a station that's been preserved, really, really wonderfully preserved, and it's like stepping back into the 70s with all of their provisions frozen through time, and the Royal Mail's most southerly outpost, I believe. The next territory is the British Indian Ocean Territory, and I was particularly honoured to be allowed by the Foreign Office to visit this territory. It's very, very, very special. It's a system of exquisitely beautiful islands in the middle of the Indian Ocean. Approximately 55, 56 in 7 major atolls. And as a geographer, they're really, really interesting. The Admiralty charts had unsurveyed written all over them. And some of the islands, 2 of the islands, in fact, even had unnamed next to them. And on other charts just had a blank next to them. That is that unnamed island there. So I, of course, had to get ashore and step on an unnamed island. One of the reasons why it's so special is because the waters are the least polluted of anywhere tested, even more so than the waters of Antarctica. And the visibility underwater is just extraordinary. Chemically underwater, you can see something like 60 meters. And here you virtually could see something like that. It's home to some of the richest corals and the most exquisite reefs on Earth. with coral growing on coral, going on coral. And unlike other parts nearby that have been absolutely decimated in recent years, here the coral is doing incredibly well. It's home to something like a quarter of all the world's reef fishes on Earth. There's a dazzling rainbow of species, including many that occur nowhere else in the world, such as the Chagos anemone fish, like a clownfish basically, and a unique brain coral. So very special. The islands have been impacted in many, many different ways. Most of them are predominantly covered in plantations of coconuts, but some of them still have their intact ecosystems of hardwood forests. And these are exquisite in so many ways, rich with plant life and bird life. The birds literally fill the trees. But what really makes this place special is it's one of the last large systems of islands in the world with an intact invertebrate ecosystem. There were no mammals on these islands, so invertebrates ruled the land, particularly crabs. And crabs filled lots of different niches. Hermit crabs on the ground, ghost crabs on the beaches, land crabs amongst the trees. But there's one species that rules supreme, the coconut crab, the biggest land invertebrate on Earth today, and actually as big as invertebrates can get in the current oxygen levels in the current atmosphere on Earth. And it was my dream to see this animal. It can have a 90-centimeter leg span. It's so powerful it can rip open coconuts. It can literally rip them open. But yet it's actually not aggressive. It's an amazing animal. Certainly if you put your hand in its claws, it would just cut straight through your fingers, certainly. But it's very easy to hold, and I loved them. I absolutely fell in love with them. That was the biggest claw. I think this crab had been cannibalized. I found this on the ground, and that was the biggest claw that I saw, so you can see how huge their claws can be. And of course, the British Indian Ocean Territory was recently made the largest fully protected marine reserve on Earth to conserve this incredible wealth. And what makes it really special, just go north a few hundred kilometers to the Maldives, which is a beautiful country in its own right, but go to the capital, Mali, and look at the contrast. You literally can't get more opposite between urban and natural. So it's a very special example of a very, 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 very unique example of one of these large-scale systems of reefs left in the world that's at a very near pristine level. In the Pacific Ocean, the Pitcairn Islands, there's only one ship that goes there on a regular basis. She's called the Claymore 2, and she calls in just 4 times a year. She has about something like 10, 12 places per rotation, and I was very lucky to get a place on her. And we reached the island, as I'm sure as you know, Pitcairn is home to the story of the mutiny on the Bounty. As I'm sure you all know, in the 1780s, an expedition was set forth to collect breadfruit to take them to the Caribbean. And the crew, led by Fletcher Christian, mutinied and put Lieutenant William Bligh, the captain, but a lieutenant, put him on a launch and cast him adrift. And he undertook one of the great voyages, open vessel voyages, all the way back to Kupang. But the mutineers took the ship, the Bounty, and had to find a place to hide away from the law. If they'd have been caught, they'd have been absolutely executed. A mutiny was the darkest word in the Royal Navy. So they reached Pitcairn, and this was the genius in the plan. Fletcher Christian, the lead mutineer, realized that Pitcairn Island had been incorrectly placed on the map. It was in the wrong place on the map. So it's impossible to find an island that's placed in the wrong place on a map except by accident. If you follow the map, you'll go to the wrong place. So it was the perfect place to hide out. The only way they could be found it would be by chance, which is very unlikely in the massive vastness of the Pacific. So they sailed the Bounty there, burnt the ship, and settled the island. And for the last 200 years, their descendants have lived there. And when I visited, there were 47 islanders that have a wonderful, warm, welcoming culture that is very interesting. They still ring bells whenever a ship is sighted. And the islanders have unbelievable crafts. They carve exquisite wooden carvings, of course, in particular the Bounty, and export these. and Pitcairn honey, and I believe there's some actually through in the map room after this talk. You're very welcome to go and see it. Of course, the island is littered with artifacts from the Bounty because the ship was burnt just offshore from the island, and nails and anchors and cannons have been recovered. I went down to dive to see what was left on the wreck site, and down underwater there was the only sign of where the Bounty was burnt were a few ballast stones. That's the only thing that remains down there. But it was nevertheless haunting and powerful to touch those stones and think that was the place, the last resting place of this incredibly historic ship. Pitcairn is very interesting because when the mutineers arrived there were no settlers. There was no people on the island. But several hundred years earlier, a large number of Polynesians had settled the island. And there are many carvings across the island, many ancient Polynesian carvings. The Polynesians certainly came here for many reasons, but one of them was for obsidian, volcanic glass. If you break it, it makes razor-sharp blades, literally as sharp as a razor. And there's very few places in Polynesia, or in the Pacific, in fact, nearby, that you can find obsidian. Chemically, this Pitcairn obsidian is identifiable, and it's been known to have been traded across vast networks all across the Pacific. And there's right by some of the sites where it's found, there are large numbers of carvings, and some of them almost seem systematic. Something like a calendar or some kind of cataloguing system, or maybe ownership. It's very mysterious and very little known, and many standing stones on the island as well. I wanted to recreate a Polynesian voyage for the documentary, and so went to a nearby island which is in the Pitcairn group. The Pitcairn group consists of 4 islands, and the largest is Henderson Island. And the Polynesians were known to have travelled frequently between Henderson and Pitcairn, trading goods between the 2 islands. So I chartered the Claymore and headed out there for a few days. It's a lost world. It's a wonderful example of unique bird life. There's there's actually 5 species of unique birds on the island. It's a very special example of unique bird life and exquisite reefs. And the UK government just recently has announced its intention to create an even bigger no-take reserve than the one in the British Indian Ocean Territory. So the British government is actually outdoing itself and making an even bigger one around the Pitcairn Islands. In the Caribbean, the 6 territories in the Caribbean and North Atlantic, we're going to very briefly look at each of those. The Cayman Islands is a very interesting one. It's covered in dry scrub, seasonally dry, tropical dry forest over very poor soils. And as a consequence, because the soils are so poor, it wasn't cleared in a really big way for agriculture, as in other parts of the Caribbean. There weren't really plantations there on any big scale. So vast swathes of the vegetation remains intact and an absolute beacon for wildlife. Something like half of the islands remains intact. This is home to a very, very special animal, the blue iguana, an iguana that occurs nowhere else in the world. But in 2002, there were just thought to be 17 left in the world, just 17 animals left of that species. It was thought by 2007 the species would be wiped out completely. But just in the nick of time, the last ones were rounded up. A team of conservationists built a breeding program and started to breed the iguanas and increase their numbers. Hundreds have been released back into the wild. Their habitat has been reclaimed, and now there's thought to be something like 600 left back into the wild from a population of 17. And when they reach 1,000, all the facilities will be closed down and the species will be safe once more. In the British Virgin Islands, home to some of the bluest and most exquisite waters in the entire world, the waters, the islands are home to some very interesting history. For example, the Cornish copper mines that were built by Cornish settlers to extract copper from the rocks. These islands are home to vast numbers of seabirds, some of the very important seabird colonies. Unfortunately for the frigate birds, these birds here, one of them is quite plagued by a problem. These trees, this is one of the largest frigate bird colonies in the Caribbean. The frigate birds go out to catch their fish, but often see fishermen reeling in fish. They snag the fishing line, catch the fish that the fisherman is reeling in. So the bird is attached with a hook in its jaw, or in its neck rather, and the fisherman just cut the line. So the bird flies back to its nesting site, carrying a line behind it. They land on the trees, and then the line creates a deadly spider's web all through the branches. And this is absolutely horrific. It forms a spider web that kills vast numbers of birds. I was fortunate to be on the island with the conservation team, and we rescued several of the birds. But it's a horrific problem, and the conservationists are now trying to work out the distribution of where the lines come from and trying to manage it as best they can. But at the moment, they just have to go and clear it frequently as best as they can. It's not the only problem from fishing, unfortunately. Queen conch shells, these exquisite giant mollusks, which occur in vast numbers in the waters, have been caught for thousands of years before Europeans, and Amerindians caught them in really big numbers as well. And entire islands have been built from their shells. Vast, vast, vast numbers. And the problem is it's not just the adults that are being caught, these ones with the flat flanges here, which shows that they're adults, but juveniles too. And when they start taking these out of the water, the population just heads towards collapse. So I went with the teams out there and filmed for the documentary, exploring this, and we're going to see a solution to this in the next territory, Turks and Caicos Islands. The Turks and Caicos are an exquisite territory of very, very, very famous reefs and low-lying coralline atolls, home to really large wetlands, really, really important and diverse reef systems, but particularly also the wetlands are home to vast colonies of migratory birds that come from North America and further afield to overwinter. They're called the Turks and Caicos Islands because they're home to a cactus that has a cap from which its flowers and fruits emerge, and it's said to look like the fez hat of Turkey. So that's one of the explanations why the islands might be called the Turks and Caicos Islands. The islands themselves have fascinating architecture. They were built primarily for salt collection, and vast areas of the islands were covered in salinas to extract and farm salt crystals, which were called white gold for their value, because before refrigeration, this was the way to conserve and preserve meat, particularly the cod fisheries in Newfoundland and the American seaboard. So salt was exported on a vast scale from these islands. The salinas, of course, are completely abandoned today, but they're still home to large populations of birds, including flamingos, right in the center of the capital, Coburn town. So there's not many capitals in the world that can say that they've got populations of wild flamingos roaming around. The islands are really special also for their reptiles. There's some really amazing ones, such as the rainbow boa, a species of snake with iridescent rainbow scales, and many, many, many other reptile species. The reason why there's so many reptiles here is because mammals are very poor at traveling on rafts. They need fresh water. They don't like salt exposure, whereas reptiles can often accomplish that very well. So there's unique iguanas here as well. Many, many, many species, several species of unique snakes as well. This is the dwarf pygmy boa, and many, many small geckos that occur nowhere else in the world. Going back to those giant islands of conchs, the Turks and Caicos is a very interesting solution. A conch farm has been set up. The eggs from the conchs are collected from the wild, grown in tanks. In the wild, 99% or more than that die in the wild, whereas in captivity, the overwhelming majority survive. And so they can be produced and reared in these tanks. They graze algae that grow in the tanks and can grow and grow and grow. It's a very valuable export then in larger tanks. And the idea behind this is to reduce the need to hunt the wild conchs and also repopulate the animals in the wild. Bermuda is the oldest of all of the UK overseas territories, and it's the oldest continually inhabited English settlement outside the UK. It's a wonderful territory with very interesting architecture. It's got well over 20 fort sites on the islands, home to very, very interesting forts dating back to the 18th century and really larger 19th century ones. It has its own unique architecture style. very, very distinctive Bermudan architecture that basically calls back to a time when the islands were settled. The roofs are made out of limestone, and every single square centimetre of the roofs is used to capture rainwater, because on a completely flat island made of limestone, rainwater is in absolute critical demand. So the roofs, are designed to capture every drop of water that they possibly receive. Their home, the Bermudans, are very, very, very proud of their cultural heritage. Once a week on a Saturday, this is one of the members of the local parliament. She's an incredible woman that for the last 20 years has been the nagging wench. Legend has it that the settlers built this chair to dump their beloveds into the ocean to teach them a lesson. And bearing in mind that she's one of the leading politicians in the territory, I thought it was unbelievably sporting that every single week she gets dunked, and they have this whole... I could think of a few politicians in London that might that might be more deserving. But anyway, she's wonderful. Bermuda was one of the very early tourist destinations. It had early flight connections to New York and other places in the US. And so it developed relatively early. And today it's by far the most urbanized of all of the UK overseas territories. The main islands are pretty much covered in suburbia or development at least. But this, of course, had a massive impact on the wildlife. Many unique species occurred on Bermuda originally. One in particular, though, was called the Cunha, a bird that lives all across the island, like those sooty shearwaters I showed you in the Falklands. It lived in nest sites on the coasts of the main islands. The last ones were seen in the 1620s, and it was thought the species was completely extinct. For 300 years, people thought it was wiped out. But then in the early 20th century, strange bird bodies were found. For 300 years, this species was thought to completely be gone. No one had seen it since the 1620s. But in the early 20th century, strange bird bodies were washed ashore. No one could identify them. No one had any idea what they could be. Then suddenly, it was thought that maybe it could be this extinct bird. An expedition was launched, and finally 17 pairs of this lost species was found. It'd be like finding the dodo today. An intensive conservation project was found. So 17 pairs were found on remote islands, and the species was brought back from the brink. But the problem was, remember those shots earlier, Bermuda is completely developed from coast to coast, coast to coast. So there was no way it could be reintroduced back onto the mainland like we've seen on other islands, like, for example, the Ascension frigate bird. There were simply too many cats, dogs, rodents. It was just not realistic. So the conservationists realized the only hope was to focus all of their efforts on offshore islands, little islands offshore that remained less impacted. And these were turned into the so-called living museum. Such a beautiful concept. The conservationists got rid of most of the invasive non-native plants, put back the native ones, and recreated the original ecosystem that would have once occurred on the Bermudan mainland. It's home to exquisite bird colonies today, including this guy, one of the tropic birds on the island, which the Bermudans called the longtail. Unfortunately, it's not friends with the cow. It evicts cows and kills their chicks. It's an endangered species in its own right, so the conservationists couldn't exactly go and just wipe it out. So their answer was to build luxury apartments for the tropic bird and special ones for the cow, which have a special entrance that only the cow can fit through. So I followed a team and looked at their efforts, and they've done a marvelous job in the last few decades of nurturing this lost species back from the brink, back from 17 pairs to dozens and dozens. I think it's well over 100 pairs now. They've brought it back from the edge of extinction, and it's once again back a common sight on the islands. Now in Montserrat, Montserrat is famous, as I'm sure as you know, for its volcano. And I learned of this as a student in my geography classes and desperately wanted to go and see it. It's a special island. It's one of the few in the Caribbean, the British territories in the Caribbean, with lush, moist rainforest, basically. And in the heart of the island is this steaming monster, the volcano. It blew up in 1995 and wiped out, it made 2/3 of the island uninhabitable today, completely evacuated. Most of the Montserratians sadly had to leave their homes. And tragically, the hammer strike fell hardest on the capital, Plymouth. I was given permission to go in the restricted area to go and see what that's like today. And it's a modern-day Pompeii. You can go through it and see the abandoned community of Plymouth. And it's interesting here, there's an abandoned suitcase outside this building that's quite telling. Inside, they're just abandoned, full of rubble. It's been raining ash for now 20 years and sporadic eruptions, so it's built up to almost roof level now. And all the signs of that once vibrant culture in Plymouth can still be seen. Even paper that's been left out in the sterile ash has been preserved in the elements. This wonderful man, Mapai, showed me his home. Right where we're standing is over his village where he used to live. And he tried to explain, he did his best to explain to me what it was like seeing rocks the size of this boulder being pelted down from the volcano. It had a massive impact on the wildlife. The bats lost all their hair. The ash is acidic and burnt off their hair. The fruit that they ate was covered in ash, and it ground down their teeth like sandpaper. But yet, nature so often is linked, life is linked with destruction, and beautiful forests have exploded back in many areas of the island. And I've been to rainforests for years all across the world, but this really is some of the most lush and glowing forests I've ever been to, including in some areas carpeted with petals and floral parts of some of the trees that rain down like pink snow. Many of the species, the unique species of Montserrat, were initially feared to be lost forever because of the volcanic eruptions, such as the national bird, the Montserrat oriole. But happily, a few hundred were found, and this very strange and very, 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 very little known reptile, the Montserrat gullywasp, which is only known from a few hectares, just a tiny area about the footprint of the Royal Geographical Society premises. But the islands are incredibly resilient. The community's bouncing back, and it's very interesting to know that they've bounced back several times from much of the island was once covered in plantations, and the forest has even regrown from that before the eruption, so it's coming back. The last of the Caribbean territories, Anguilla, is a very interesting territory. It's flat limestone islands, home to a dry tropical forest scrub with frangipanis and tillandsia air plants, really large colonies of seabirds, very, very important regionally. But it has a very surprising secret. Underground for such a flat island, it has vast cave networks. And in these are the best examples of Amerindian presence of all of the UK overseas territories. Strange carvings emerge from the darkness as you explore these underground passages. Dozens and dozens and dozens of them have been found in this one cave alone. This is Fountain Cave. And many of them are exquisitely beautiful and intricate, and testimony to that Amerindian presence. The last of the territories in the Mediterranean now, Akrotiri and Dhekelia, two bases on the island of Cyprus. They're home to some enormously important bird wetlands, including the largest lake on the island of Cyprus that's home to a vast colony breeding colony of flamingos, one of Europe's only chameleons. But perhaps most interesting on this territory is actually the archaeology. Vast systems, dozens and dozens of sites yield extraordinary archaeological jewels and heritage here, from Roman amphitheatres to ancient burial sites in the cliffs, where the ground is quite literally carpeted with ancient Roman and Greek pottery, quite literally littered with it. I put all of it back when I looked at it, but I just picked it up. In like seconds you can find it. It's literally carpeting the ground. Gibraltar is the most recognizable and iconic in some ways of all the territories. It's certainly the most recognizable. So I wanted to end on this territory. It, of course, is the home of the famous Barbary macaques, Europe's only population of wild primates. It also is home to spectacular wildflower colonies and several unique taxa of plants that occur nowhere else in the world, as well as massively important migration sites for many, many birds, and particularly raptors, particularly birds of prey. But I could tell you stories on all of those things, but I actually wanted to end on two quite humble stories that really touched me. And of course, this World War II heritage, vast chambers and secret passages built in the rock itself. But the stories that I want to end on is this one, which I found perhaps most inspiring of all the territories, precisely because it concerns an animal that's so inconspicuous. There's a little limpet. No one would care about it. It's called the Mediterranean ribbed limpet. It's gone extinct across most of its range. It used to occur all across the Mediterranean, but it's gone extinct virtually everywhere where it once occurred. And one of the last strongholds is in Gibraltar. The most important site in Gibraltar was going to be completely developed and turned into a marina. But the conservationists put such determination and effort into this. They moved all the rocks the limpets were on. But the problem is you can't just move a rock and put it on a truck and take it somewhere, because the vibrations will cause the limpets to drop off and they'll die. So the rocks had to be taken off from their home sites, put on lorries with special beds with mattresses on them to enable the limpets to survive, transport them to the new site, be lifted back into the same positions with exactly the same level above sea level and angle towards the sun so they could graze the algae on which they survive. And you can easily say, oh, that's why bother waste money on such a boring species as a limpet? And that is very easy to say, but the conservationists made a point that really touched my soul when I was there. They said, basically, every single species we lose, we're poorer for. Who knows, that limpet, that species could have untold pharmaceutical benefits in the future, let alone just the moral responsibility. Sure, it may well be not as spectacular as the blue iguana on Cayman, but it's not any less important. And so I found that story really, really inspiring and saw their efforts. The last of the stories on the territories that I want to tell you is this one, which in some ways is the most exquisite and elegant of all. This cave on Gibraltar is called Gorham's Cave. Gibraltar was actually the place where one of the first Neanderthal skulls was found. Homo neanderthalensis, a different species of human. It was actually found on Gibraltar before it was found in the Neander Valley in Germany. The skull was brought back to England, probably very close to where we are. There was a famous meeting of the British Association of Advancement of Science. The skull was also seen by Charles Darwin, who concluded that it was a different species of human. The skull from Gibraltar, I mean. In the last few decades, unbelievable discoveries have been made inside this cave. It's very, very special because it has a lip and then goes down inside, and basically storms blow in sand that quickly cover anything inside the cave. So you have an unbelievable picture. In some cases, the day in their life of Neanderthals. You can find their hearths. You can see even what they were cooking. In some cases, they found hyenas had come in, chewed the bones of whatever was being cooked on the fire, left waste, and then ran off. And all of that was perfectly preserved under the sand. And they're excavating this. And they've even found art from Neanderthals. The very first example of art outside the human species has been found in this very cave. And this is Gibraltar 2, the skull that was found that inspired Darwin so much. So this is interesting because Gibraltar has been Moorish, Spanish, and British for 1,300 years, but it was a stronghold for Neanderthals for 100,000 years. And today, the saying goes that there was originally a saying that went that the British will leave if the macaques ever, the rock will fall if the macaques ever leave the island. Winston Churchill believed this so resolutely that during World War II, to boost troop morale, he shipped in loads of macaques from Africa to boost the macaque colony. It really was very significant because remember, Gibraltar at the entrance to the Mediterranean really had a pivotal role in the war. But possibly the reverse should be true. Perhaps it's not that we will only stay until while the macaques are there. Perhaps it's our responsibility, the UK government's responsibility, to work with all the people across all the territories to ensure this incredible treasure remains. The last minute or so of my talk, I just want to say that the most important thing of all these territories, yes, they're an extraordinary side of the UK that few people know, but the most important point from all of them is that it's not too late. We do live in a depleted world. Massive amounts of wildlife is gone, but it's not too late. We've seen dozens of stories of wildlife, plants, animals being reversed and saved on the territories. It totally is within our power to do that in many cases, and we really can. So an enormous thank you to all the NGOs, of course all the territories, and the hundreds of individuals, particularly also the Warehouse 51 team, who I know are many here today, including Steve and Vicky at the front, who produced the series that's going to be on the BBC shortly. The series is called Britain's Treasure Islands. Just a few hours ago, the BBC confirmed that it's going to be on in April. Provisionally, they said April the 14th. They're going to confirm next week. It might possibly change a few days, but probably April the 14th will be the first episode, and then it'll continue for 3 weeks. A very, 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 very sincere thank you to Lord Ashcroft, who donated the funds to give a copy of the Britain's Treasure Islands book to every single secondary school in the UK to educate an entire generation about this extraordinary heritage that the UK is responsible for. Should you wish to, there's 2 prototypes in the map room which you can go and happily go and have a look through. I'm just finishing it now. It's going to go to the printers and be released in June. So it's a 704-page book and a collector's version as well that looks at all of these stories in much more detail, of course, than I can present in 1 hour. Each territory has its own fold-out map and explores the territories. This website has also just gone live today. It's called britainstreasureislands.com, without an apostrophe, just britainstreasureislands.com. It's only just gone live today. Over the next week, I'm populating it with images and text. The idea is going to be a really lovely way that anyone can find out about the territories. It's obviously totally free. There's already hundreds of images on there. And perhaps most importantly, the mini-documentaries. These are short films that were made using the footage not in the BBC series, the broadcast series, and they're intended as a totally free resource to give to anyone and everyone that wants them. They're going to be put online, and I know there's lots of NGOs here with whom I've been working. The hope is that they'll be available for everyone to use, to showcase on their websites, anywhere that they want, to show this incredible heritage. And they've already been finished. They're just being finalized now and going to go live in the next 2 weeks. So if you go to britainstreasureislands.com in 2 weeks, you can watch all of them. So yeah, check the website. I will confirm, but I believe it's April the 14th. And just finally, we're going to put quickly one of the mini-documentaries on so you can see in footage, some of the stories that I've told you about. And I think Mike's going to come up for a talk. So thank you very much. I'm going to come back up. So this is quickly one of the mini-documentaries intended to give an overview of the territories in video. So thank you.